This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. A cattle market update from Oklahoma State University livestock economist Derrell Peel begins today's show. He explains the impact of New World Screwworm on the U.S. and Mexican cattle market. Keeping the show rolling is Jenny Ifft, K-State Flinchbaugh Agricultural Policy Chair, discussing a farm income outlook for Kansas. She breaks down how producers' products could look for 2025. Drew Ricketts, K-State Wildlife Specialist, ends today's show, reviewing research that has been done looking into chronic wasting disease being found at feeders. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with a cattle market update from Oklahoma State University livestock economist Derrell Peel. Derrell, thanks for joining us today.
Great to be with you today.
Derrell, starting with a hot topic that we've seen a lot on headlines, New World Screwworm, and where are we at and what's the history that we've seen in the past 6 months?
You know, New World Screwworm is a pest that the U.S. actually controlled in many years ago, 1966. We eliminated it in the U.S., working with the Mexicans in particular. It was eradicated in Mexico not too long after that, a few years after that, and has been out since then. It's endemic to South America, and so the border for the last 30 years or so for the last several years at least, has been Panama. And the New World Screwworm sort of escaped that border a couple of years ago, worked its way up through Central America, now into Mexico. And so the U.S. is concerned and has closed the border again to cattle imports in particular until such time as we can get control of it again.
Did the border ever actually fully reopen?
You know, we closed the border first last November 23rd, right before Thanksgiving. And that was done when the screwworm was only detected in the very southernmost part of Mexico, but to get new protocols in place, some additional inspection procedures, quarantine facilities, and so on. And once those were in place, those facilities were ready to go. We reopened the border in early February and had been bringing some cattle back in for the last, since February until May 11th, and we had brought in about 200,000 head thus far this year. And then with the detection of New World Screwworm farther north in Mexico, at a point now where it's much more concerning to the U.S., so the border is now closed again.
What cattle do we usually bring in from Mexico?
The vast majority of cattle we bring in from Mexico are feeder cattle, mostly steers, but sometimes heifers. These would be steers and spayed heifers. And so they come in as feeder cattle. They're usually relatively lightweight. They often go to stocker programs for grazing for a while, then to a feedlot and on through the system. You know, more recently, some of the cattle are a little bit heavier, and with tight cattle supplies, some of those cattle are coming in and going straight into feedlots in the U.S., obviously mostly in the southern part of the U.S.
Do those spayed heifers that we usually bring in have a little bit of a timeline and maybe in a bit of a tight spot?
They can be, yeah, because the rules on spayed heifers, of course, it requires a surgical procedure to spay those heifers. And so once they're spayed, they have a 6-month window to get into the U.S. And they actually have to heal up after surgery before they can export. So take some time off the front end of that. And then they've got 6 months at the end. So roughly about a 5-month window, those heifers have to come. So heifers that were spayed in November, right before the border closed the first time, would have to be in by this time in May, actually. If they didn't get in before we closed the border again a week or so ago, then they're not going to make it in. They're going to have to stay in the domestic market in Mexico. And if there are any heifers that they have been spaying again recently in anticipation of exports, they won't come in now. And if they don't make it in before that 6 months clock expires, they won't be eligible for export at that point in time.
And Derrell, as someone who's worked a lot with the Mexico cattle market, what does this possibly mean for them?
Well, there's lots of implications. You know, for many, many years, we have imported cattle from Mexico. So particularly the northern part of the Mexican cattle industry has been oriented towards producing mostly steers, again, to export to the U.S. They count on that market. And obviously, with our markets as tight as they are and prices that they are, it's very attractive. So they would like to export. And so this is a pretty serious economic blow to those producers. Those cattle will ultimately reroute and reabsorb into the Mexican cattle industry. But now with a border closure, there'll be a sharp difference in value between the Mexican market and the U.S. market, whereas otherwise they tend to sort of equilibrate between the two countries. And of course, the other factor that's going on right now in Mexico is the fact that northern Mexico is experiencing a very serious drought. And so they've been fighting, a lot of issues relative to hanging on to animals to get them to export. That opportunity is now gone again. So they're being forced to liquidate cattle simply because of drought conditions in the northern part of the country.
What do potentially the next steps mean for New World Screwworm and getting that border back open?
The U.S. is going to be watching. Now it's a question of really containing and controlling that pest. Again, it's reached a point in Mexico that's farther north in an area where it's going to be much more difficult to control now. So I think it's probably going to take some time. And the facilities that produce the sterile flies, which is the primary means of controlling New World Screwworm, is maxed out basically on capacity right now. So it's going to be a very challenging process, and I think a fairly lengthy process to make progress in controlling that fly in Mexico and verifying, of course, monitoring for some period of time that it's controlled before the U.S. would be willing to reopen the border.
With that reduction of imports of cattle from Mexico, what does it mean for the U.S. cattle market?
Well, Mexican cattle historically, for the last 30 or so years, we've imported around 1.1 million head a year, which, that's about 3.5% of our calf crop annually. So it's not a huge percentage, but it is a significant percentage. And if we abruptly close the border and don't get those cattle for, let's say, several months or so, then that's a noticeable decrease in supplies in an already tight U.S. market. So it is a factor. I think the market initially reacted very positively in terms of price to that news. It's not by itself not a major market factor, but it's a significant one at the margin and adds to an already supported market situation.
And what are we seeing for our cash cattle market right now, Derrell?
I tell you what, these cattle markets continue to be extremely strong, both feeder and fed cattle markets. Now, there was a lot of volatility this last week in the future side, so some of the feeder markets were a little bit flatter depending on the weight group, but by and large, we continue to see these markets move higher. Fed cattle markets continue to move higher. They're running on a cash basis this last week, generally in the range of 218 to 220 or so in the south and up to 224 to 226 in the north, I think. And these markets are not showing much seasonal pattern. So it appears that there's an underlying trend. Fed cattle markets often would be falling back a little bit through the middle of the year at this time of the year. The lightweight calf markets often peak in the first quarter and come down through the middle of the year. Neither one of those has really happened this year. So that suggests that the trend in the market is offsetting the seasonal tendencies.
What are we seeing for box beef?
Box beef has, over the last 2 or 3 weeks, has rebuilt to higher levels. It's kind of holding steady in that 348 to 350 range for choice box beef. If you look at wholesale cuts over the last month or so, the seasonal pattern for buying for grilling season has been very strong. Much of that buying takes place in April into maybe very early May. And so it's all in place now for Memorial Day. But we saw very strong seasonal movements in several of the steak items that are popular for grilling. So strip loins, top sirloin, those kinds of things, as well as, with cow slaughter down as much as it is this year on top of decreases the last 2 years. The lean trimmings market, which is a major driver for the ground beef market, is extremely high. It's at record levels at this point in time.
When are we going to stop seeing record levels, Derrell, or is that any time in the near future?
That's a great question and one that I'm getting a lot, and it certainly makes sense. There will be a top someday in this market, but the thing that ultimately is going to put a peak in this market will be turning around cattle inventories and putting together some rebuilding. And we have some indications now, and they're really only early indications, that we may be starting that process. We might be retaining some heifers now. I don't have data to actually confirm that at this point. but the indications are that we might be starting that process. That says that someday, we're going to actually squeeze things tighter and probably push prices even higher during that process of retaining heifers for herd rebuilding. And then at some point after about a 2-year lag, those additional heifers would turn into additional calf production and ultimately increased beef production. So all of that to say that it's going to get tighter and prices are going to get higher before they would turn around and go the other way some ways down the road.
What are you thinking we're going to be seeing as we enter Memorial Day and the unofficial start of grilling season?
Well, right now it looks pretty promising. I think, again, beef demand indications are very strong. We'll be watching the weather, obviously, across the country. But if it's the kind of weather where people do take advantage of Memorial Day, get out and have a lot of outdoor activities, fire up the grills, then, that'll be very positive for beef going forward. For producers, we're enjoying these high prices. We continue to see record markets. We also see a lot of volatility in this market. And, we kind of live in a headline world right now where headlines have a lot of impact on markets of all kinds, including cattle markets. So producers really need to consider protecting themselves from a risk management standpoint for specific marketing windows that they're going to need to take action in. Even though our general expectation is pretty bullish and we expect higher prices, anything can happen on any given day for, one day or a few days or maybe a week or two. And so you need to protect yourself for those marketing windows.
Derrell, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
You bet. Happy to be here.
That was Oklahoma State University livestock economist Derrell Peel. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue our Monday show talking about a Kansas farm income outlook with K-State Flinchbaugh Agricultural Policy Chair Jenny Ifft. Jenny, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Jenny, as we're looking at this Kansas farm income outlook, first wanting to distinguish, how do you calculate this farm income for this report?
So you could think of it like the income statement for all of Kansas agriculture. And this is on a cash basis. So this is for income that's received in 2025, no matter what year the income was actually earned. And we'll get to why that's important soon. But again, it's all of agriculture in Kansas. So it does reflect, crops, livestock, government payments, everything, crop insurance.
And what is the Kansas farm income projection for 2025?
Well, the number is $7.74 billion. And that's up from $4.14 billion last year. So we are predicting a sizable increase. And the big part of the story is that it is an increase in government payments, mostly one-time ad hoc government payments that were authorized at the end of 2024 for losses incurred in 2024 and to a smaller degree, losses incurred in 2023. But, otherwise across the board, crop receipts are expected to go up a little bit, and that's mainly because our forecasts assume a return to normal or average yields. Livestock receipts would be up a little bit. Production expenses are down a little bit, so that's a positive on the income statement. So the net effect is we do expect to see an increase in income in 2025.
And breaking down a few of those different categories and starting with Kansas crops, what are you seeing?
Again, we are expecting them to be up, assuming normal yields. We do expect to see a decline of not quite about a half million acres in production, so less acres in production than last year. Prices are generally down or flat, and you can we can look at our individual crops. So for corn, we do expect to see a 2% increase in acreage. Return to normal yields, lower prices. The net effect is still a slight increase in receipts. For soybeans, it's sort of the same story. We do expect to see an increase in production, driven by a return to normal yields, a slight decline in acres, which is consistent with what's happening at the national level. But the net effect is an increase in receipts. Wheat's declining quite a bit. We're expecting to see about 30,000 less acres planted of wheat. I know profitability for wheat has been challenging for a lot of producers. But again, if you assume normal yields, we do expect to see a slight uptick in wheat production. For sorghum, same story. If we have regular weather conditions, normal yields, despite a decline in prices, we would expect a slight increase in sorghum receipts. So again, let's hope we have normal or even better than normal weather this year, and that could offset the low prices that we're seeing.
What are we seeing then when we look at Kansas livestock?
So, for livestock, first of all, this year livestock is 64% of cash receipts for Kansas agriculture. So this is a big part of the story. And of that 64%, so 89% of livestock receipts come from cattle and calves. And we do have lower inventory this year. It has ticked down, so 3%. We have 20,000 lower head of cattle and calves than we did a year ago as of January 1st, but continued strong prices. So we do expect cash receipts to go up. And so we are looking at $15 billion in cash receipts for cattle and calves in 2025. So that's contributing to that increase. We also do have, you can look at dairy, hogs, and hogs. Well, if you add them up, they're about 9% of total livestock receipts. And for dairy, we are expecting slightly more production. So that's in terms of the number of cows and production per cow. A slight decline in prices, that's pretty stable. Hogs are pretty stable as well, so stable inventories and pretty similar prices. So, and from a historic perspective, I'm saying about the past 10 years, livestock across the board is doing relatively well. Crops have started to come down. I would also notice, across the state of Kansas, even within a county, you're going to see all different kinds of financial performance. But 2024 was a rough year for a lot of crop farms due to the depressed prices, higher continued expenses. And so I think you'll probably get into more of that when you talk to the Kansas Farm Management Association, but I think it's important to note that.
Do we often see that more than half of cash receipts do come from livestock, or does that sometimes shift from year to year?
It's going to shift from year to year. It's usually 50% is the number I use, actually. That's kind of the baseline, but now we have such strong livestock prices and crops are coming down, so it does swing higher sometimes.
Well, how are we also seeing expenses come down? So
they are coming down. I think a lot of producers would like them to come down a little bit quicker, but it is what it is. And it's really a mixed bag. So feed costs are coming down. That's expected. Also, fertilizer, pesticides, and fuel costs are coming down. Purchased livestock, that's going up. And, that's something you're going to expect. Labor costs are also going up, which I don't think is terribly surprising. But the net effect is you are seeing some relief on the expenses side. They are going down as a whole.
What about projections for 2026?
So for 2026, really it would be about the same except for government payments. And this gets back to those payments. So a lot of the ECAP, Emergency Commodity Assistance payments, those have already gone out. But that was authorized. That was a one-time payment for 2024, authorized at the end of 2024, being paid in 25. There was also disaster payments that were authorized, and we do expect to get a sizable amount of disaster payments. If you think about 23, large crop insurance indemnities, a lot of drought pressure across the state. And there were some parts of the state in 2024 that also had pretty low yields. So we are expecting to get some of those disaster payments, and the dates have actually been announced for those, and we're expecting those to come out, and that's throughout the year. But those are one-time payments. We can't forecast one-time payments for 2026. That would get into political forecasting. Not a business I want to go into. But yeah, so without any one-time payments, you'll see an almost $2 billion drop in government payments in 2026. And you'll go back to it's $5.84 billion, which is still a little bit higher than 2024, and a lot of that's due to strength on the livestock side. If you look at those numbers, there's a lot of swings, and it's really everything. You have, the crop markets are coming down, livestock markets have been going up, and they've been staying up, but the government payments also go up and down quite a bit.
Jenny, when you looked at these outlooks, any surprises?
No. I mean, we knew, at the end of 24, those government payments were coming. I am expecting a sizable amount of disaster payments to go out. I think there's going to be surprises in crops and livestock sooner or later. I think there is a lot of uncertainty there, with what happens with global trade, especially. On the crop side, though, we do have, if you look back, the crop insurance guarantee is based on, for corn, soybeans, and grain sorghum, price discovery was back in February. So, say for corn, your crop insurance guarantee is based on $470. So that does provide at that level, that does provide some protection for 2025. So for at least this year in terms of that revenue guarantee.
If people want to find out more information, how can they do that?
So we work on these forecasts in partnership with the Rural and Farm Finance Policy Analysis Center at the University of Missouri. So that would be raff.missouri.edu. So that would have a summary of the forecasts as well as the underlying data. You can always go to agmanager.info. And we will be doing a webinar on June 17th with Dr. Greg Eibendal, and he's going to be using the Kansas Farm Management Association data and doing a forecast for those farms. And I think that's going to be really nice because I think this is very complimentary information. We're looking at the income statement, the farm income forecast for the state as a whole. He'll be looking at farm level forecasts and can really get into some of those differences we're seeing across farms and across the state.
Jenny, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having me.
That was K-State Flinchbaugh Agricultural Policy Chair Jenny Ifft discussing the Kansas Farm Income Outlook. This outlook is from the Rural and Farm Finance Policy Analysis Center at the University of Missouri. If you'd like to find this Outlook publication, you can do so by going to raff.missouri.edu, or you can also find it by going to ruralandfarmfinance.com. Again, that is ruralandfarmfinance.com. I will link this Outlook publication as well in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Monday show talking about chronic wasting disease with K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts. Drew, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Shelby.
Drew, what recent research has come out involving chronic wasting disease?
There is constantly a lot of research coming out about chronic wasting disease, but we've got a brand new study that was published very recently in the Journal of Wildlife Management by some researchers out of Mississippi State University, wildlife scientists there who really focus a lot of research on deer. And their research is the first project to really look at whether or not deer feeders can facilitate the spread of chronic wasting disease among deer and potentially other wildlife species too.
And what did this research find?
Yeah, so it's a really robust study. They put out brand new deer feeders, and these are plastic feeders, and they had 3 different treatments. So they had control feeders that didn't have any feed put in them. Then they had feeders that had a mix of corn and protein feed in them that were available to all wildlife, including deer. And then they had some feeders that they built exclusion fences around, but that would exclude deer, but that that had holes cut below them that would allow raccoons and squirrels and those sorts of critters to come in. So for that part of the study, they found chronic wasting disease prions, infectious prions, on all the feeders that included feed. So that confirms that deer, when they eat out of a feeder and the saliva from their mouth, the secretions from their nose, and those sorts of things deposit these infectious prions that cause chronic wasting disease on those feeders. The brand new thing that I don't think very many people have thought about that this shows is that raccoons, even in the absence of deer eating from those feeders, can move those chronic wasting disease prions around from feeder to feeder. That part of this study was conducted in an area of Mississippi where they see about 30% prevalence of chronic wasting disease in the adult deer population. That is lower than the areas in Kansas that have the highest chronic wasting disease in deer, but it's probably higher than most of eastern Kansas would be. During their study, they also detected chronic wasting disease for the very first time in parts of Mississippi. And so the research team went to that area and swabbed a bunch of feeders that were present in the area. And they actually were able to detect chronic wasting disease prions even in those places where chronic wasting disease prevalence was very low in the deer population. So that's very confirmatory for this.
What about for the other places deer are eating? Because they're not just eating at deer feeders.
Sure, that's something that folks talk about a lot, right? We have natural feeding sites. We also have food plots and those sorts of things. And so the researchers also put cameras on the deer feeders. They put cameras on food plots that they established, so cool season food plots during the hunting season. And then they put cameras out in areas on masting oak trees, so oak trees that were producing acorns during the time when deer should be feeding from them. And they saw that the deer feeders had 12 times higher deer activity than the oak trees did and 2 times higher activity than the food plots did. They also found that deer-to-deer contact was significantly higher at the feeders than it was at the oak trees. And it was also fairly high, quite a bit higher at the deer feeders than it was at the food plots. So their research is really the first project to show definitively that feeders can be potentially maybe increasing the spread of chronic wasting disease among deer, that they definitively increase contact rates and those sorts of things. One of the crazy parts about the raccoon piece of this study is that there have been other studies that have shown that the more times that these chronic wasting disease prions pass through different species, the more likely it is that those prions may cross the species barrier and infect a new species. So there's some implications about that for both chronic wasting disease infecting new species of wildlife, but also maybe increasing the potential that it could cross the species barrier and infect humans. So really impactful research.
Drew, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
That was K-State Wildlife Specialist Drew Ricketts. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.